In 1997, Apple Computer was 90 days from bankruptcy. Steve Jobs had just returned to the company he co-founded, and Wall Street was calling it a lost cause. Michael Dell, when asked what he'd do with Apple, said, "I'd shut it down and give the money back to shareholders." Fast forward to today. Apple is worth over $3 trillion. But here's what most people don't know. The story you've heard about Apple starting in a garage, that's only about 10% of the truth. Today, I'm going to tell you the real story of Apple. The one with betrayals, billion-dollar gambles, and decisions that almost destroyed everything. This is the untold story of how a garage startup changed the world. Let's start with that famous garage. 2066 Chris Drive, Los Altos, California. Yes, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak did work there. But here's what history books don't tell you. They weren't building computers in that garage. They were building a scam. Before Apple, Wozniak created something called a blue box. This illegal device let you make free long-distance phone calls by hacking AT&T's phone system. Jobs, still in high school, saw the potential. They sold these boxes for $150 each, splitting the profits. They made thousands of dollars before nearly getting caught. Why does this matter? Because it taught them their first business lesson. Wozniak was the genius engineer. Jobs was the visionary salesman. This dynamic would define Apple for decades. But the real origin of Apple doesn't start in a garage. It starts at the Homebrew Computer Club in March 1975. While other hobbyists were showing off circuit boards, Wozniak was quietly designing something revolutionary, a complete computer that normal people could actually use. Here's the untold part. Wozniak worked at Hewlett-Packard, and by law, HP owned anything he invented. He actually offered the Apple I design to HP 5 times. They rejected it every single time, calling it a toy. Their lawyers eventually released the rights, thinking it was worthless. That rejection changed history. On April 1st, 1976, Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and a third co-founder most people forget about, Ronald Wayne, started Apple Computer Company. Jobs sold his Volkswagen van for $1,500. Wozniak sold his HP calculator for $250. But here's the crazy part. Ronald Wayne owned 10% of Apple. That stake would be worth over $300 billion today. 12 days after founding the company, Wayne got cold feet and sold his shares back for $800. Jobs and Wozniak had been in debt from their blue box scheme, and Wayne was afraid he'd be liable for their debts. The single most expensive mistake in business history. The Apple I wasn't really a computer as we know it. It was a circuit board you had to connect to your own keyboard and TV. No case, no power supply, just 50 fully assembled circuit boards sold to a local computer store for $666.66 each. Why that price? Wozniak liked repeating digits. That's it. No satanic conspiracy. Just a nerdy engineer who thought it looked cool. But the Apple II? That changed everything. Launched in 1977, it was the first mass-market personal computer with color graphics, expansion slots, and a plastic case. It looked like something that belonged in your home, not a lab. Here's the untold story that saved Apple. In 1979, a program called VisiCalc launched exclusively on the Apple II. It was the world's first spreadsheet software. Suddenly, businesses had a reason to buy personal computers. People weren't buying Apple IIs to play games or learn programming. They were buying them to run VisiCalc. Apple didn't create VisiCalc. They didn't even commission it. They just got incredibly lucky that the developers chose their platform. The Apple II generated $139 million in revenue by 1980. The company went public that December with an IPO that created more instant millionaires than any company since Ford in 1956. Steve Jobs, at 25 years old, was worth $256 million on paper. But Jobs knew the Apple II wouldn't last forever. So in 1979, he made a deal that would change computing forever. He traded 100,000 shares of Apple stock, pre-IPO, worth about $1 million, for 3 days inside Xerox PARC, the research facility where the future was being invented. What Jobs saw blew his mind. Computers with graphical user interfaces, windows, icons, and a mouse. Xerox had invented the future and didn't even know it. Their researchers thought these ideas were 10 years away from commercial viability. He turned to his engineers and said, "They're sitting on a gold mine. We're going to do this, and we're going to do it right." Xerox executives later called it the biggest missed opportunity in business history. They traded the future of computing for $1 million worth of stock. Jobs bet everything on creating that graphical computer. The project was called Lisa, named after his daughter, though Jobs denied the connection for years. Here's what they don't tell you. Jobs was originally leading the Lisa project, but he was such a nightmare to work with that Apple's board kicked him off his own project. Furious and humiliated, Jobs basically hijacked a smaller project called Macintosh. He turned it into his revenge mission. The Mac team worked in a separate building with a pirate flag flying outside. Jobs told them, "It's better to be a pirate than join the Navy." The Macintosh launched on January 24, 1984, with the most famous commercial in advertising history, a woman throwing a sledgehammer at Big Brother's screen, destroying conformity. The message was clear: Apple was going to destroy IBM's monopoly. Initial sales were spectacular. 70,000 Macs sold in the first 100 days. But then something happened that almost nobody talks about. Sales fell off a cliff. Why? The Mac was too expensive at $2,495. It had only 128 kilobytes of memory, which wasn't enough to run serious software. It had no hard drive, no expansion slots, and worst of all, there was almost no software for it. By early 1985, Macs were sitting unsold in warehouses. Apple's stock price dropped 50%. The company that had been worth billions was hemorrhaging cash. Jobs had recruited John Scully from Pepsi with the famous line, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world?" But now Scully saw Jobs as the problem. Jobs was demanding, abusive to employees, and refusing to accept that the Macintosh was failing. In May 1985, the board sided with Scully. They stripped Jobs of all operational duties. He wasn't fired, but he was exiled, given an office with nothing to do, no authority, no projects. On September 17, 1985, Steve Jobs resigned from Apple. He was 30 years old. The company he'd started in his parents' garage had kicked him out. But here's the part that Hollywood got wrong. Jobs didn't leave quietly. He convinced 5 key Apple engineers to leave with him, taking Apple's most sensitive technical knowledge. Apple sued him for $250 million. The bitterness was real. This wasn't a clean break. It was a divorce. Jobs founded Next Computer, determined to build the perfect machine. He spent months obsessing over details. The computer case had to be a perfect cube. The factory had to have color-coded machinery. Everything had to be beautiful. The Next Computer launched in 1988 for $6,500. It was gorgeous. It was powerful. It was revolutionary. And it was a complete commercial failure. By 1993, Next had sold only 50,000 computers. Jobs shut down the hardware division. Meanwhile, Jobs had bought a small computer graphics division from George Lucas for $10 million, calling it Pixar. He poured $50 million of his own money into it, nearly bankrupting himself. His wife Lorene worried they'd lose everything. Pixar made one last desperate bet, a full-length computer animated film called Toy Story. If it failed, the company would close. When Toy Story opened in November 1995, it made $192 million domestically. Pixar's IPO a week later valued the company at $1.5 billion. Jobs had pulled off a miracle, but he wanted Apple back, and Apple desperately needed him. By 1996, the company was a disaster. They had sold dozens of different Macintosh models with confusing names. Market share had dropped to 3%. Microsoft was dominant. Apple was dying. CEO Gil Amelio needed a new operating system. He considered Windows NT, Sun Microsystems, and Jean-Louis Gassie's BEOs. But in December 1996, Apple bought Next for $429 million, bringing Steve Jobs back as an advisor. Here's what really happened next. Jobs immediately began undermining Amelio, calling board members, criticizing decisions, positioning himself as the savior. In July 1997, the board fired Amelio and named Jobs interim CEO. Jobs was back, and he was about to stage the greatest comeback in business history. Steve Jobs returned to a company with 90 days of cash left. His first move shocked everyone. He called Bill Gates. On August 6, 1997, Jobs announced that Microsoft would invest $150 million in Apple and commit to developing Microsoft Office for Mac. The crowd booed. They saw it as surrender. But Jobs knew the truth. Apple needed cash and credibility. Microsoft needed to avoid antitrust charges of monopoly. It was brilliant strategy disguised as desperation. Jobs cut Apple's product line from 40 products down to 4: a professional desktop, a professional laptop, a consumer desktop, and a consumer laptop. That's it. Everything else was canceled. Then in May 1998, Jobs revealed the iMac, a translucent blue computer that looked like it came from the future. No floppy drive, integrated monitor. The I stood for Internet. It was beautiful, simple, and different from anything else on the market. Critics hated it. Where's the floppy drive? They asked. How do you expand it? Jobs didn't care about critics. He cared about customers. The iMac sold 278,000 units in its first 6 weeks. Apple was profitable again, but Jobs had a bigger vision. In 2001, he launched the iPod with the slogan, 1,000 songs in your pocket. Most people don't know this. The iPod wasn't even Apple's idea. They bought the technology from a company called Portal Player and hired a consultant named Tony Fadell who had been pitching a similar device to other companies. Apple didn't invent the MP3 player. They just made it beautiful, simple, and integrated with iTunes. Then in 2003, Jobs did something that seemed insane. He launched the iTunes Store, selling songs for 99 cents when the music industry was trying to stop piracy. Record labels thought he was crazy. Jobs convinced them by arguing, "People don't want to steal music. They just want an easy way to buy it." The iTunes Store sold 1 million songs in its first week. Jobs had just saved the music industry from itself. But the Real revolution came on January 9, 2007. Jobs walked on stage and said, "Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone." The iPhone had no keyboard, no stylus, just a touchscreen and 3 apps: Phone, Mail, and Safari. Industry experts called it a toy. Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer literally laughed at it, saying, "There's no chance that the iPhone is going to get any significant market share." The iPhone sold 6 million units in its first year. But here's the untold story. Jobs didn't want third-party apps on the iPhone. He wanted to control everything. It was his engineers and board members who convinced him to open it up. The App Store launched in July 2008 with 500 apps. Today, there are over 2 million apps, and the App Store generates over $80 billion per year. Jobs fought against the very thing that made the iPhone dominant. Sometimes the genius of Apple wasn't Steve Jobs having all the answers. It was Steve Jobs being willing to be convinced when he was wrong. Steve Jobs died on October 5, 2011, from pancreatic cancer. He was 56 years old. Here's what most people don't know. Jobs had delayed surgery for 9 months, trying alternative treatments like acupuncture, herbal remedies, and juice fasts. His doctors later said that delay may have cost him his life. Even Steve Jobs, the man who could reality distort his way through anything, couldn't outsmart biology. Jobs left behind a company transformed. When he returned in 1997, Apple was worth $3 billion. When he died, it was worth $350 billion. Today, under Tim Cook, it's worth over $3 trillion. But here's the deeper legacy. Apple didn't just change technology. They changed how we think about design, simplicity, and user experience. Before Apple, computers were beige boxes that you tolerated. After Apple, they became extensions of ourselves. Jobs once said, "Innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower." But the real Apple innovation wasn't the technology. It was understanding that people don't want features. They want their lives to be better. The untold story of Apple isn't about a garage startup. It's about failure and redemption. It's about blue boxes and pirate flags. It's about a company that almost died 3 times and came back stronger every time. It's about a man who was fired from his own company and returned to save it. From a garage in Los Altos to the most valuable company on earth. That's not just a business story. That's mythology. So there you have it. The real story of Apple. The one with mistakes, lucky breaks, and decisions that could have destroyed everything. What's your biggest takeaway from this story? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into tech history, consider subscribing because I've got more untold stories coming your way. Next week, we're covering the Real story behind Microsoft, and trust me, it's even crazier than this one. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.